Hi, everybody. I'm Jim. Welcome to Great Books, Big Ideas. I'm continuing my series of videos on The Great Conversation by Robert Maynard Hutchins. This is from Volume 1 of the Great Books of the Western World set, where he lays out his vision for liberal education and reading the great books. We're up to Chapter 6, and this chapter is called Education for All. And he's asking questions here. Can we really achieve a liberal education based in great books for everybody, or is this a pipe dream? Naysayers would claim that this project that Hutchins is advocating is irresponsible, disingenuous, possibly even anti-democratic. How could that be so? Well, the naysayers paint the proponents of liberal education with a very broad brush known as guilt by association. Liberal education, they say, was once the purview of aristocrats. How could an elitist form of education be appropriate for everybody else? Hutchins counters that notion by re-emphasizing a point he has made before. Formerly, only the elite classes had the leisure time and the political power to get a liberal education, and that liberal education was fitting for those who had leisure time and political power. But now that we live in a democratic society where power is vested in the people, presumably, we all have political power, and we have more leisure time than ever before. So it is not inappropriate to want to have this form of education, of a great books-based liberal education for everybody. It would only be anti-democratic if this ideal of liberal education couldn't be achieved. Now, it seems to me that this question of practicality, of achievability, is a harder criticism to refute. This criticism rests on some weighty assumptions that Hutchins is going to critique himself. So the assumptions go something like this. If we attempt to give liberal education to everybody, we shall fail to give it to anybody. In other words, equal opportunity for all can't work. It's a myth, it's a pipe dream, it's a fantasy, it's a delusion. Now, Hutchins responds by accusing those critics of elitism. There are two types of elitist critics who argue from such a position. One group says we shouldn't even try to do something that would inevitably fail. Don't bother. It's not worth your time. And the other group would say that if you tried it, the attempt would result in an inferior product, inferior education. And yet, we should see to it that some people, a select few, should receive a liberal education. By this logic, the critics condemn the masses to what Hutchins calls a modern version of natural slavery. I find this to be just a totally elitist argument. Hutchins reminds us that nowhere on earth has universal liberal education even been attempted. So it's never been proved not to work. We haven't even tried. Undoubtedly, this educational prospect is a tall mountain to climb. And speaking for American education, we have a lot of room for improvement. And Hutchins, on this score, pulls no punches. So let me read a little bit from pages 44 and 45 of my edition. He says, many claims can be made for the American people, but nobody would think of claiming that they can read, write, and figure. Still less would it be maintained that they understand the tradition of the West, the tradition in which they live. The products of American high schools are illiterate, and a degree from a famous college or university is no guarantee that the graduate is in any better case. One of the most remarkable features of American society is that the difference between the uneducated and the educated is so slight. The reason for this phenomenon is, of course, that so little education takes place in American educational institutions. But we still have to wrestle with the question of why this should be so. Is there so little education in the American educational system because that system is democratic? Are democracy and education incompatible? Do we have to say that if everybody is to go to school, the necessary consequence is that nobody will be educated? Since we do not know that everybody cannot get a liberal education, it would seem that if this is the ideal education, we ought to try to help everybody get it. Those, especially who believe in getting the facts and the experimental method, should be the first to insist that until we have tried, we cannot be certain that we shall fail. It's the naysayers who are the real anti-democratic voices in this debate. Let me quote again from page 45 what he has to say. I think he's pretty eloquent on this point, and it's worth reading. The business of saying in advance of a serious effort that the people are not capable of achieving a good education is too strongly reminiscent of the opposition to every extension of democracy. This opposition has always rested on the allegation that the people were incapable of exercising intelligently the power they demanded. Always the historic statement has been verified. You cannot expect the slave to show the virtues of the free man unless you first set him free. When the slave has been set free, he has, in the passage of time, become indistinguishable from those who have always been free. Now, he also sort of almost does a psychological analysis of his critics here. The critics of liberal education discriminate against anyone who doesn't belong to their in-group. And this is really the logic of prejudice, discrimination, class war, racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism, and so on. Hutchins doesn't say this, but I'm just extrapolating from the point that he's making about in and out groups. This is discriminatory to think that people can't get this type of education. The real problem with education as it is construed is that we don't give students a chance to succeed. It's like we're defeatist to the core. And some of this, Hutchins thinks, stems from intellectual laziness. Liberal education is not the easiest path, no doubt about that. So we settle for something less and soothe ourselves that liberal education wouldn't have worked out anyway. At this point in the argument, Hutchins hauls in some supporting evidence. There are, in fact, a few colleges who have made the Great Conversation a linchpin of their curriculum. He must have in mind programs like Columbia University, University of Chicago, where Hutchins had been president, and St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. He doesn't mention them specifically, but that has to be like what he's thinking of. There weren't too many colleges out there that were trying to do this in the 40s and 50s. Moreover, for nearly a decade, adult readers had joined Great Books discussion groups across the country. And this was a fad that I'd love to tell you more about on another occasion. It's really fascinating, and it precedes the launch of this book set. In fact, I think they launched this set of Great Books of the Western World because they felt like they had a readership out there who would be willing to buy these books based on the popularity of the Great Books discussion groups. The point is, there is some evidence that a Great Books-focused liberal education can work, so why don't we try harder to implement it more widely? Let's come back to the difficulty of reading great books. It's something Hutchins does not deny, but the fact is, Most of these books were written for ordinary people. We find them difficult to read because we haven't given the books a chance to teach us how to read them. And I'll quote from the text here. There is a sense in which every great book is always over the head of the reader. He can never fully comprehend it. That is why the great books in this set are infinitely rereadable. That is why these books are great teachers. They demand the attention of the reader and keep his intelligence on the stretch. Some would say that maybe we should let the specialists, the scholars, be the custodians of great books. Let them explain them to us. It's like their thing, and they can work on the great books. They're hard to read, so they can work on it. They can do their scholarship, their research, and then they can help us to understand them. But Hutchins thinks that is textbook aristocratic thinking. Let me quote from page 48. Sir Richard Livingstone said, "No doubt a trained student will understand Aeschylus, Plato, Erasmus, and Pascal better than the man in the street, but that does not mean that the ordinary man cannot get a lot out of them. Am I not allowed to read Dante because he is full of contemporary allusions and my knowledge of his period is almost nil? Or Shakespeare, because if I had to do a paper on him in the Oxford Honors School of English Literature, I should be lucky to get a 4th class? Am I not to look at a picture by Velázquez or Cézanne because I shall understand and appreciate them far less than a painter or art critic would? Are you going to postpone any acquaintance with these great things to a day when we are all sufficiently educated to understand them, a day that will never come? No, no. Sensible people read great books and look at great pictures, knowing very little of Plato or Cézanne, or of the influences which molded the thought of or art of these men, quite aware of their own ignorance, but in spite of it, getting a lot out of what they read or see." In fact, too much context, too much historical and biographical knowledge can pose barriers to a genuine encounter with these books. But there's an even greater problem for Hutchins. He calls it the dogma of individual differences. Here's how this pernicious logic operates. We're all different. Can't deny that. We are all different. Therefore, we all require custom-tailored education to fit our differences. We cannot suggest that everybody should read the same books. We're all different. We must devise individualized curricula and let the students take more elective classes. Is that really wise? To let an 18-year-old decide what to take? We ought to know better. He says the art of teaching consists in large part of interesting people in things that ought to interest them but do not. So the art of teaching is to take something that you didn't think you were going to be interested in, and the teacher makes you interested in it. Think about whether that's happened in your own education. And if you have examples, leave a comment. Let me quote an example that he uses from page 50 of the essay. Here's Hutchins speaking. "I say that Shakespeare should be a part of the education of everybody. The point at which he is introduced into the course of study, the method of arousing interest in him, the manner in which he is related to the problems of the present, may vary as you will. You could take different approaches to Shakespeare. You could teach him at a different point in a student's schooling. But Shakespeare should be there because of the loss of understanding, because of the impoverishment that results from his absence. The comprehension of the tradition in which we live and our ability to communicate with others who live in the same tradition and to interpret our tradition to those who do not live in it are drastically affected by the omission of Shakespeare from the intellectual and artistic experience of any of us. So, if there is really no common ground, if we're all different, how can we have community? You can't have community without some common ground. Yes, of course we are different. We should respect differences. But we're also the same. And in a world of increasing division and specialization, we need a common humanity like never before. And so if we must individualize education, let it be more about teaching methods than the books that are taught. There'll be time later on to specialize. So that's chapter 6 in The Great Conversation. I'm not sure whether Hutchins has put forward a convincing case for the feasibility of liberal education for all. I do appreciate his staunchly democratic stance. It's a defiantly democratic stance, and his refusal to align liberal education with elitism. And I don't see any reason why he's wrong on that score. But it does feel idealistic, for sure. And we have to admit, with the lamentable state of education today, I confess that it's hard for me to imagine that a program of liberal education in great books could ever get off the ground. It's less feasible today than it was in Hutchins's day. Are there other ways to gain a liberal education outside the school system? Chapter 7 may hold some clues for us. It's called The Education of Adults. Until next time, let me know your thoughts about achieving a liberal education for all. Do you think it's a great idea? Is it hopelessly idealistic? How can we achieve it? Leave a comment and join the discussion. If you'd like to see more of my content, please like and subscribe. And I thank you for watching. Thanks so much.